Let's look at your presentation scores, because that's the one I think is going to be most interesting to people. But what I'd like to
Okay.
do is, rather than really just sort of talk about it in lots of detail, I'd be interested to try and get a little bit of value out of you while we're speaking. So, what are some of the common mistakes that
Yeah, of
people
course.
make when they're making presentations, and what would you recommend they do instead?
Okay. Well, oh, there are so many. Let's start with some almost fundamentals, but it's two of the biggest mistakes people make. My favorite quote, I use it all the time. If you looked at my Twitter feed, you'll have seen it. It's by George Bernard Shaw, and it's the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taking place. So I'll say that again. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taking place. Cracking quote, sums up the whole communication challenge, whether that's in presentation or indeed, other forms of communication. So one of the challenges that many people face is, whether they enjoy presentations or not, is that they suffer from what's often called the curse of knowledge. So typically, if you're presenting on something, it's something you know pretty well. Maybe it's something you've worked on for weeks, months, even decades, or you know your subject well. And the tendency is to, with some sort of evangelical zeal, try to convert everybody else by just bombarding them with detail. And it just kills it stone dead because they haven't got a hope, basically. There was a marvelous experiment done back in, I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, by a lady whose name I now can't remember, but she was studying for her degree in communications at, I think it was Stanford University in the US. And she completed a very simple exercise where she would have a couple of people come into a room. One of them would have to tap out, so, the sort of tapping type thing, would have to tap out a really well-known song. The other person fundamentally had to identify what that song was. But the crux of the whole thing, which was for her dissertation or PhD or something, was that before they did that, people had to predict the success rate. And on average, people expected at least 1 in 2 people to get it right. The reality proved to be more like 1 in 40.
All right.
And fundamentally, it's because if you imagine, I don't know, let's say it was the Star Spangled Banner for sake of argument, if you're tapping that out, in your head, you are singing along to the Star Spangled Banner.
Mm-hmm.
All the other person hears is a load of dull taps. They don't have that context. And that is the curse of knowledge. That sums up the sort of presentational challenge, because we tend to communicate stuff in a presentation because we've got all this extra information, but the poor audience members are normally being bored to tears anyway and have got very little context to grab hold of. So the first thing is really less is more.
Right.
The shorter the presentation, the better. Fundamentally.
Yeah.
Guy Kawasaki, who's one of the early Apple marketing gurus and now, I think, a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, one of the things he talks about is saying, no more than 20 minutes and maybe 10 slides.
Yeah, 10, 20, 30, isn't it?
He's being pitched.
10,
Yeah,
10,
absolutely.
20,
10, 20, 30. So, and
10 slides, 20 minutes, 30
and
point font.
the killer, and that's the killer, the 30-point font, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
Very hard to conform with, really. But the mere fact that, he's getting people pitching for multi-million investments, and he's saying, look, if you can't convince me in 10 slides and 20 minutes, you don't know your business. And he's right, really. So this curse of knowledge is a fundamental trap that we all fall into. And that leads us into giving far too much detail, far too much information, populating our slides with masses of stuff. And what that then does is the sort of second label is we send our audience onto what is often referred to as journeys of self-discovery, which sounds terribly grand. But what that really means is you have got your audience thinking about stuff that you don't want them thinking about. And that can be really simple, So when you say to somebody in a presentation, oh, well, next will be the coffee break, but first, the minute you've said next will be the coffee break, In some places we'll say, well, that's great signposting, but half of your audience are now imagining their coffee, thinking about their coffee, what they're going to have with their coffee, and they are now not listening to the rest of your presentation until the coffee break starts. So that's a simple example of how that works. So with lots and lots of information, we tend to send our audience off into all sorts of different journeys of self-discovery. You've put a table on a slide that you're showing people full of data. So the classic, somebody's cut and paste out of a spreadsheet or something. Half the audience are checking your maths. But
Yes.
what they're not doing is listening to what you're saying. So it's
been there, done that.
It's fundamental, really. The trouble is, I understand it's because it seems easier. The classic cut and paste strategy seems easier.
Yeah.
But it isn't.
Do you believe in the 10-minute rule that after 10 minutes people's attention drifts off and you have to do something about it?
Well, yes and no. Yes, I believe that if you are not engaging people. But equally, I was about a year ago now, maybe, I went to a literary festival event in Oxford, and the actor, which you will know being from the UK, Simon Callow, was talking. It was the, I think, 150th anniversary of Charles Dickens, and he was doing a talk about Dickens. There was, 500 of us in a marquee. He spoke for an hour. He stood at the front. He had no props. He had no pictures. He had nothing. He just stood and
I bet he was absolutely brilliant.
And it was fantastic. You could have heard a pin drop for the entire session. So yes, I do believe in that 10-minute rule, in the sense that if you are not engaging the audience in the way that the audience need to be engaged, you'll be very lucky if you make it as far as 10 minutes, because they're all going off on these individual journeys. On the other hand, if you are engaging people, they'll stay with you for ages.
So how do you get away from death by PowerPoint?
Well, a number of different things, really. So, one of the things is keeping very, very simple. Guy Kawasaki's 30-point font rule is a real killer, but it's a really good thing to bear in mind, because at the end of the day, you can't get many words on a slide. And people make the mistake. My view of PowerPoint is this: there are three ways fundamentally that you use any. It doesn't have to be PowerPoint; it could be any of the software, because Prezi or no, I can never remember the Apple one. But
Keynote.
Anyway, Keynote. Yeah. So there are three ways that fundamentally people use it. The most common way that people use PowerPoint as a presenter is that they use it as their auto cue. So the minute you see somebody put a slide up and it's got bullet points on it, there's probably a 95+% likelihood that what you're seeing them present is their presentation notes. The slide is not designed to engage an audience. It's not designed to remind, to support what the presenter is saying. It's actually designed to remind the presenter what they're going to say next. One way of avoiding death by PowerPoint is do not put your presentation notes on your slides. That is not the purpose of the slides. The second trap that people fall into is that they intend their slides to also be their handouts at the end of their presentation, or they can email them afterwards type stuff. Again, if you are designing your slides to be a handout, then people, when they print them off or look at them on screen, can deal with much smaller fonts, lots of information, because they're controlling the time and doing it at their own pace. But in a presentation, it almost certainly guarantees there'll be far too much information on the slide. So
and how
the slides fundamentally are there only to support what you're saying.
And how does that differ when you're doing, we've both done online courses and we've done, presentations in front of audiences. So do those rules change if you're producing an online course?